Welcome to my hot take on the new Zenith El Primero Chronomaster Sport for 2021. If you don't want to wait till the very end, I'll give you that right now. It's a cracking update to an iconic watch, and it is absolutely not a knockoff of the Rolex Daytona. And most importantly, that I had to say that last bit is a real problem, and it probably worthy of more discussion. Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. As promised, this is my hot take on the Zenith El Primero Chronomaster Sport, the latest variation, update, edition, if you like, of the Zenith Chronomaster line. This is important. The El Primero is one of the 5 or 6 really important chronographs, along with, say, the Navitimer and the Chronomat from Breitling, along with the Speedmaster, along with the Hoya Monaco, and the obvious one of the Rolex Daytona. They represent the core of the most significant chronographs for the vast bulk of the watch collecting hobby. And so any update or addition to that line is really important. Now, often with Zenith, we kind of lose track of what they're doing. They're a smaller brand. They're part of the LVMH group. The history of the El Primero, unlike a lot of those other watches, isn't contiguous. It is broken here or there. But I think we're seeing real revival in interest in the El Primero generally, things that are not Rolex generally, Zenith generally, LVMH generally, all of those things combined to make this a release which is probably getting a bit more coverage than you might otherwise expect. So with all of that background said, in a nutshell, what has Zenith done to update the El Primero? Well, I think the first thing is we'll start from the outside and work our way in. So we'll start by looking at the styling. In short, in fact, before I even go any further, if you really want all the details, don't rely on me. If you know my channel at all, I don't go into this in great detail, this sort of technical stuff in great detail. Go check out the Watch Advisor. They've got like a 27 or 30-minute video deep diving into this. If you don't want to spend that long, then Time and Tide have got a very good video that goes for about 7 minutes, cuts to the chase a bit, but also goes through the styling and movement changes, again, in more detail than I ever will. But anyway, quickly back to me. Broadly speaking, what they've done is added a new variant to their line. So the Chronomaster's got like a simple line, then they've got like a slightly more avant-garde Chronomaster 2 line, they've got a revival line, and then an open line, which is just kind of a partially skeletized version. That's, if you like, the Chronomaster lineup. What they've done is added a sport line, which kind of combines the core Chronomaster simple bezel-less or internal bezel-less design, gives it the exterior bezel that was with the more avant-garde Chronomaster 2, and then adds a lashing of kind of old style Zenith El Primero De Luca kind of styling cues. So a little bit less avant-garde, a little bit more kind of historic adjacent upgrades, which makes the watch very accessible, very easy, very simple for us to understand and appreciate. In general, what's happened with those changes is the interior tachometer scale has been removed. That's been moved to an exterior bezel, which now has a 1/10 of a second scale instead of a tachometer. By removing the scale from the bezel and putting it on, from the dial and putting it on the bezel, it's really simplified and decluttered that dial, I think, making it a lot easier and a lot cleaner. I think it's also that 4:30 date, which is always a bit awkward, and particularly so on the very busy original Chronomaster line becomes a bit easier and a bit more digestible with the sort of cleaner dial. It's also got a slightly modified case, again similar to the older DeLuca Chronomaster from back in the late 80s, early 90s. A little bit less elegant. I personally think the slightly shorter lug, slightly squatter look makes the watch a little less elegant than the other Chronomaster line, El Primeros. However, it does promise to be more wearable. A lot of people really struggle with the wearability, the very quite long sweeping lugs on the original El Primeros. So I think whilst the stylistically this new sport model is a little bit chunkier, not quite as svelte, it's probably more wearable and probably open to more people to actually buy and wear comfortably. Okay, so that's the styling. What about under the hood? And this is probably where the biggest changes have occurred. Just like the Rolex Submariner update and the Omega Speedmaster update, the new Zenith El Primero gets a new movement, moving from the old caliber 400 to the newer caliber 3600. The Caliber 400 is a Trojan, a classic, an icon. That is such an overused word. I think I've used it a dozen times already, but it is all of those things. Unfortunately, it's also old. And its design reflects a lot of just engineering understanding and engineering shortfalls of the time it was developed. Overly complex, uses 3 parts when it could have used 1, no rationalization of fasteners and that sort of thing. What we've got with this update is not a re-architecting of the watch, rather just good, solid engineering updates, new materials, rationalization of the number of parts, rationalization of the overall design, minor tweaks to the gear train, none of which radically changes the way the watch works, simply makes it easier to work, even more functional and more reliable across the board, and probably a whole bunch cheaper to make. All of that is goodness. None of that is bad. They're not taking shortcuts. They're actually doing things smarter, which I think is really good for us. So overall, what that means we're getting is a watch which by and large has had quite a nice little stylistic update, incorporated some things like the external bezel, which a lot of people really like to see on a chronograph, makes a few little wearability upgrades, cleans up the dial a little bit and gives it a new movement. All in all, that's a really solid update of a much loved watch, and we could end this video here. This could be all I need to say. The biggest thing is, though, that there's another question that I think needs more looking at. Like always, often with the updates of these icons, it's not so much the change to the watch that's interesting. It's it's the questions that change asks us. And in this case, this update really asks us 2 questions. Is this watch a knockoff of the Rolex Daytona? And secondly, if it's not, and I don't think it is, why do we have to ask that question at all? And what's going on in our heads that's something we have to talk about? I think that's actually the most interesting thing to come out of this release, and it's what I'm going to talk about right now. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. Is this a Rolex Daytona knockoff? In short, absolutely not. Have a look at this watch in detail, and I mean really look at it hard, and you'll see that the case is different, the lugs are different, the bracelet attachment is different. You'll see that the registers are fundamentally different. You'll see that it actually has a date. You'll see that the indices are different. You'll see that the fonts are different. The text on the dial and on the bezel are different. The function of the bezel is different. One's a tachometer, one's a 1/10 of a scale, 1/10 of a second scale. You'll see that the crowns and the pushes are as different as you can be and still be a chronograph that's a wristwatch. So given that all of that is different, I can't see how you could possibly say that this watch is a knockoff of the Rolex Daytona. And yet, I'll be honest, even I find myself having to ask myself that question. Even I, on first glance, saw strong similarities. So even though I know that the Zenith is not a knockoff of the Daytona, the fact that even I, not a Rolex fanboy, not someone who's into that group, that collection of watches, someone who has no ambition to ever own a Daytona, even if I see that and have that immediate reaction, I think that says something that needs more examination. And that's what I'm going to do now. Why are we seeing a similarity in something which is not similar at all? And why are we almost inevitably coming to this kind of question? What's going on? And I think that there's really three things going on here that's making us see this similarity that isn't perhaps either there at all or nowhere near as strong as we think. And we can see the differences only after we look at it really carefully. The first is our naturally lazy human brains. The second is the way that Rolex marketing is stepping in and taking advantage of that lazy brain and skewing the way we even think unconsciously. And the last thing that's going on is, in that world where we have lazy brains and then Rolex marketing coming in and kind of skewing our thoughts, that's being exacerbated by the fact that we actually don't have particularly good memories, and quite often we have big gaps in our knowledge that enables that marketing, that even further drives that marketing into sort of skewing our thought processes. So let's go back and start with the fact our lazy brains. Our brains spend 80% of their time on autopilot. If they didn't, we wouldn't be able to do anything. This is, I love more than anything else. There's a book by Kahneman on thinking fast and slow, and he basically says 80% of the time, go read it. It's a fantastic book. Most of our brain is spent having a quick look at something, dragging out a few essential points, creating a thumbnail sketch, and then comparing it to something else and lumping it all in together. Now, if you take a thumbnail sketch of a Rolex Daytona and a Zenith El Primero, you can basically sum it up this way. Overall classic watch profile, steel case, black ceramic bezel, 3-register white dial chronograph on a 3-link bracelet. There you go. That's it. That's both of those watches. And your brain, when it quickly, bang, sees a watch and instantly has to do something, that's what it creates. And it takes every watch that looks vaguely like that and lumps it together. And not only that, it then starts to blur them so that unless you try really hard, what it does is it starts to take all of those things and mash them together so that everything that's got those kind of characteristics, the highlights join and the differences kind of get filtered out and we don't see them so much. Then what happens though, that thumbnail sketch is a lot to remember. And this brings us to our next bit of the power of Rolex marketing. We've now got this category of watches, which is all being kind of jammed together, given some generic characteristics, and where the similarities are being highlighted and the differences are kind of being squashed. Then we have to give it a name. And at this point, this is where Rolex marketing, decades of marketing, billions of dollars of marketing steps in and helps us out. It then takes that category of watches that look vaguely like that, and in this case, names it Rolex Daytona. So as soon as you see a watch that hits that kind of that thumbnail sketch, then your brain has already lumped it into a group, said it looks vaguely like this, therefore it is this, and your brain, subject to, as I say, decades of marketing, billions of dollars of marketing, millions of words about the wonders of Rolex, all mean that your brain automatically tags that thumbnail as Rolex Daytona. And we see this not just with this particular watch, it's with everything. Recently we had the introduction of I think it was the Zen 105 UTC, a watch wildly different to the Rolex Explorer, except for two things. Has a white dial and an orange GMT hand. That's it. Of all the other characteristics, those are the only two. And they're not even, it's not the same orange and it's not the same white. But that's all it took for people to instantaneously switch over and say, it's a Rolex Explorer. And you see that kind of thing happen over and over and over again. Minor, tiny little things, whether it's a white dial or a steel bezel or an orange hand. Rolex's marketing has become so powerful that our brains automatically associate that thing and any other product with that characteristic with Rolex. And so the first thing we do is we say, oh, it's got a steel bezel, it's a Rolex Explorer clone. It's got it's got a Pepsi dial. It is a Rolex GMT Master clone. It's that simple, and it's really unfortunate, and it's perhaps unavoidable. On top of that, on top of our lazy brains, on top of the fact that Rolex marketing has taken advantage of our lazy brains, what we also have is just gaps in our own knowledge and or poor memory, poor recall of what is actually real. Most people don't even know that there was an earlier version of the Zenith Chronomaster that was the model for this new version. Most people don't even know that the original DeLucas existed. Even if they didn't know it, most people would forget it. Even if they remembered it, the power of the marketing is such that that memory, that knowledge and that memory is then deprioritized, pushed down and buried deeper in the analysis. I'll give you an example. If you go back and look at some of and I sort of did some research for this part, go back and look at the very first introduction, the very first articles on Hodinkee and other sites when the Rolex introduced this new Daytona back in 2016 with the black Cerachrome bezel. And instantaneously, in the first couple of words, they reached back and started talking about the original Daytona 6240 reference, like back in the 60s, that was the last Daytona to have one of these black bezels. So they very quickly went from from 2016, they jumped back to the 1960s and said, this watch clearly comes from here. And yet when they look at something like the new Chronomaster, their first jump isn't back along the line of the Zenith, but actually within a couple of lines, Hodinkee and everyone else has gone. And I think actually with Time and Tide, it's like in the first sentence, the first reference we have, the first sort of milestone in the development of this new watch that's mentioned is actually the Rolex. And then its link to its own history, in this case the DeLucas, is pushed to the back of the argument, is pushed to the back of the article. So whereas a Rolex comes along and they say, here's a 2016 Rolex and we can go back and see history of where it might have come from back in the 1960s and just skip everything else that happened in the middle. No one else gets that benefit. Everyone else gets a case of, this is what they're doing now. This is what Rolex did 5 years ago. Oh, by the way, Zenith did something similar to this 20 years ago, but we'll kind of push that to the back of the argument. It's not, I've leaned heavily on Rolex here, but curiously, this kind of short attention span and gaps in our knowledge actually crop up quite frequently, even on lesser known brands. So some classic ones that I've noticed lately would be, say, Breitling introduced the new Capsule 57, the Super Ocean Heritage kind of re-edition. And the first thing everyone was doing is calling it a Captain Cook knockoff, having no idea that it was actually referencing an original Breitling that predated the first version of the Captain Cook. People had kind of just either forgotten that it existed, or because of marketing and recency, simply ignoring Breitling history. Something similar, sticking with Breitling, happened with the 765 re-edition, the AVI 765, where people instantaneously said, well, this is obviously some sort of homage to the Breguet Type 20, when in fact it was the reverse. It was referencing a watch which, again, predated the, in this case, Breguet, that everyone thought was the source of the homage. It's that it's that short-termism, those gaps in our knowledge and our memory, that then, in conjunction with marketing and recency that we see from other brands, combine all that with our lazy brains, mean we see similarities, we see knockoffs, we see replicas, we see borrowing, when in fact there was nothing going on. And what instead we see is brands legitimately maintaining their own watch history, their own design aesthetics, their own looks, and getting zero credit for it, instead simply being accused of copying someone else. Okay, so all of that rambling and ranting done and dusted. God, I hope I can get something useful in the edit out of that. Where does that leave us? One, I think this is a really solid update to a really important watch. As I said earlier, the Zenith El Primero is one of the icons. It is one of the most significant chronographs in the most important segment of the watch market, the middle. And so this is a watch which has to be treated with care, an update that needs to be treated with care, as the Submariner, as the Speedmaster was. And I think Zenith has done an excellent job. They have stayed well within their own styling cues. They've reached back into their own family history. They've brought forward design themes which are really true to who Zenith is, that really capture what a lot of the market was looking for. And whilst a couple of the changes, like the case shaping, I think have made the watch a little less elegant, have probably made it more wearable and opened up its appeal. So I can kind of see why they've made the change, even though I would have preferred they not do it. I can kind of get it. And I think across the board, this is a really solid update and a useful addition to the El Primero Chronomaster line. Okay, so all of that done. What about the other issues about the way we get sucked into seeing things like this as a homage, as a knockoff to other watches? Are we doomed? Are we stuck? I would say both yes and no. And this watch and the discussion around it is really useful because it brings that problem to the fore and also shows us how to get out of it. We are doomed because we're stuck with the problem. We're stuck with the brains that we have. The brains that we have work the way they do, and we're not going to change that. We are always going to be subject to marketing, and marketing is designed carefully and scientifically by people who know the weaknesses of our brains, press on those soft points, and create these biases within us. We can't stop that initial response. We are stuck with it. But here's the good news. We can get past it. We can recognize that our initial call, our initial feelings, our gut reactions, our knee jerks can be wrong. And we can drag ourselves from the 80% of our brain working fast and loose and dirty and lazy, and we can focus on the details and see the glory of something in isolation, all by itself. And we can break those connections. Even better, I would say that if you look at a lot of the watch coverage of this watch, you can see that the industry is trying to do that. Whether it's the Hodinkee article or the Time and Tide article or me in this, you do see people struggling with that initial reaction and then dragging themselves back to see this watch in isolation. So I certainly think the professional media is doing that very well. I think the enthusiast media is struggling a little bit more. And I would say, if you can take anything out of this video, that whenever you have one of those initial reactions that this is a knockoff of that, this is borrowed too much from this, take a deep breath, look at the details, look at the history, examine what you do and don't know, and then ask yourself that question again. And I think you might be surprised at the answer, and you might find far more very original watches after that discussion than you had before it. And one of the best things I like about this new Chronomaster is that it has asked us those questions and made us really examine ourselves. And I think a watch which says, that reflects back at us and makes us ask ourselves hard questions about us, is actually really cool. And I'm so glad this watch came out. Anyway, I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. I hope to God I can turn this ramble into something kind of useful. The edit is going to be a real challenge for me, and I think this video might come out a bit late. Christ, I hope I don't have to shoot it again. Anyway, we'll see how it goes. Leave a comment below. Check me out on Instagram and do the like, subscribe thing. I really should do more of that kind of channel building stuff. Anyway, catch you later. Bye.